Hello and welcome to this Kuwait television live coverage of the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference COP27, hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh. World leaders meet in Egypt today, tasked with taming the terrifying consequences of global warming as they face gale-force geopolitical crosswinds, including the conflict in Ukraine and economic turmoil. More than 45,000 registered COP27 participants representing parties, organizations and scientific communities will be attending the Sharm el-Sheikh summit as expectations are high from a world justifiably anxious about the climate-addled future as deadly floods, heat waves and storms across the planet track worst-case climate scenarios. The delegates kicked off the climate summit with the agreement that sets a positive tone for the COP27 summit as governments voice hope to keep alive a goal to avert the worst impacts of planetary warming. And to talk about all of the importance of this historical summit and the impacts of global warming on the world, we are accompanied in this live coverage by research scientist Dr. Yehya Naji Al-Hadban from the Energy and Building Research Center at Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. But before we start our special coverage with our esteemed guest, let's view this report and get back to you.
Climate Change Conference COP27 creates a unique opportunity for the world to come together, mend multilateralism, rebuild trust, and unite at the highest political levels to address climate change, with over 100 heads of states and governments attending the summit in Egypt this year. Last year, Egypt submitted a request to host this year's session of the conference and was chosen as the only African country that expressed its desire to host it, following a system of rotation between different continents. At that time, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi announced that Cairo would make the conference a fundamental turning point in international climate efforts in coordination with all parties for the benefit of Africa and the world at large. The Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Summit will feature 6 roundtable discussions, which will focus on enhancing implementation across 6 priority issues. These discussions will provide the opportunity for political and civil societal leaders to gather and develop practical and impactful solutions to several of their climate challenges. Over the past years, the latest nationally determined contributions NDCs synthesis report indicated that countries are beginning to bend the curve of the global greenhouse gas emissions downward. Developing countries are most vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, such as floods, droughts, and wildfires, and meeting the needs of these countries will be a focal point of this World Summit negotiations. Asserting the necessity of action, UN Chief Antonio Guterres stressed that it was time for a historic pact between developed and emerging countries, with richer nations providing financial and technical assistance to help poorer ones speed up their renewable energy transitions. Earlier, the United Nations had warned that there was no credible pathway in place for capping the rise in global temperatures under the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. While worst-case projections are less dire than a decade ago, current policies would still see Earth's surface warm a catastrophic 2.8 Celsius and no less than 2.4 Celsius, even if countries meet all their carbon-cutting pledges under the Paris Treaty. Rich nations will also be expected to set a timetable for the delivery of $100 billion per year to help developing countries green their economies and build resilience against future climate changes. As heads of states arrive in Sharm el-Sheikh for the historical summit, the International Monetary Fund earlier had received $40 billion in pledges for its new Resilience and Sustainability Trust to address challenges such as climate change. Building resilience to the effects of climate change will cost trillions of dollars over the next decade, and COP27 will boil down to a trio of interlocking priorities, which are emissions, accountability, and financing.
Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, raising awareness and finding solutions, avoiding the worst impact of climate change. Global emissions need to be reduced. It's time for climate action. Pledges and commitments, clean energy and sustainable development to protect the globe.
Welcome again to Kuwait Television live coverage of the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference COP27 hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh. With our guest here in the studio, Dr. Yehya Naji Al-Hadban from the Energy and Building Research Center at Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. Good afternoon, Dr. Yehya.
Good afternoon, Amran, to you and our lovely audience and for your excellent team.
Thank you for being with us. Can you tell us, Dr. Yehya, Kuwait's participation in the summit? What is the importance?
It is a very important issue, the climate change. It's the great challenge for the United Nations and the world, the countries of the world. And Kuwait is a well-established figure among those countries that always it adds with its participation to the enhancement of the environment and the sustainability of the countries and the globe. In addition to that, Kuwait is an economic oil-producing country that can play a major role on the rules and regulations that are established by the United Nations through the climate change summits or COP meetings. One of the most important things that Kuwait, it has its own positive participation through its economic participation by developing, providing budget to enhance projects in needy countries, in least developed countries and other poor countries where it leads to the enhancement of the lifestyle and preserving the environment and continuous sustainability for such countries.
Outstanding. Can you please explain to us the main effects of climate change in Kuwait and the world specifically?
Well, climate change, if I may, before I answer this question, to say it's a phenomena that it used to exist in a natural level. You know, when we talk about climate change, it is about the greenhouse gases that are existing in the atmosphere at certain concentrations. But after the Industrial Revolution that came up in the 1700s, where industrial countries started using fossil fuels and specifically coal to burn such fuels and to operate their plants and factories, which led to the increased emissions of the greenhouse gases and specifically the carbon dioxide, which led to the rise of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and performed some kind of a big cloud around the globe. We know naturally the solar radiation comes to the earth from the sky to give the required temperature for us to be able to live on the globe. Part of this solar radiation stays and the rest of that solar radiation leaves to the outer space. With the increase of the greenhouse gases, specifically the carbon dioxide, it started trapping the majority of the solar radiation in the earth, which led to what is known as global warming, the greenhouse effect, and resulted in the phenomena or the biggest challenge to the United Nations and the world, which is climate change. The result of such things is having raised temperatures in many regions of the world, in addition to such raised temperature leading to heat waves, and we all came across such heat waves recently by seeing European countries which never used to have very high temperatures during summer. They are facing those things. In addition to that, droughts in many countries in Africa and other countries that led to the depletion of the living on that because of the drought. The depletion of the ice in the Arctic, where it is getting less in volume and size, and leading also to the rise of the sea level, which is a big risk for many countries by having the risk of disappearing because of the rise of the sea level and leading to, the disappearance of those countries. So many results that are a big risk for the human and the countries. That is because of the climate change.
And what is expected of COP27?
Right. Now, since the climate change challenge came, the countries came up with different conclusions. It started with the Kyoto Protocol, where there were some commitments were announced for the industrial countries to commit themselves on reduction on their emissions. So with the advancement of the technology and the societies, where heavier use of the fossil fuels took place in the plants for the industrial countries, which led to increase of their emissions. This led to discussing such issue in many COPs. The COP, it is a conference of parties, where, for example, if we start at the COP at Paris in 2015, it was announced that as a target, let's try our best to avoid the rise of the global temperature to preferably to below 2 degrees, but let's target 1.5 degrees Celsius. Of course, this is in comparison with the global temperature before the Industrial Revolution. Now, when the Glasgow summit, the COP26, took place in Glasgow, it was the first time the countries specifically announced, let's work hard on reduction of use fossil fuel, specifically coal. Of course, the COP26 took place a year ago. All those ambitions needs long duration until it is achieved. The industrial countries and the advanced countries are giving promises, but up till now, since the Kyoto Protocol, none of those are able to commit themselves. For the Sharm el-Sheikh COP 27, the target is to focus on the commitment of those promises. Every year, the countries are coming and establishing a new ambition and new targets, but really they are forgetting about the original promises to cut down in their emissions, where you are going away from the main cause and reason of the climate change and the global warming and trying to create other paths where it might help minorly in such things. So the target in Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 is to go for the commitments for all the promised issues from the industrial countries and from all the other countries. Specifically, when we talk about climate change, we target 3 main elements. The first element is mitigation, where countries, whether it is industrial countries or developed countries or least developed countries, where some projects should be invested in, and that will help to reduce the reliance on the fossil fuels and cut down in the emissions. This is one thing, and this issue of mitigation used to be discussed all the time, and 90% of the promises in the past used to focus on mitigation. But Sharm el-Sheikh Summit, COP27, this year, they would like to focus on the other important element, which is the adaptation. Because of the climate change and the global warming phenomena, where many developing countries under high risk of being disappearing, or humanities suffering from diseases and loss of lives. So the target also to focus more and increase the focus on what is known as adaptation, where solutions should be put for countries to be protected from those natural phenomena that are destructive. For example, we all heard in the news a few months ago about the floods in Philippines, also in Bangladesh and in Pakistan, where all those phenomena, all those crises are happening because of climate change and the global warming. In addition to that, like I mentioned earlier, I mean, the rise of temperature, even in Europe, where I remember it's like when I went to study in the UK before, someone told me that in the past, buildings in London never need to put air conditioning. Now, an air conditioning is a must. It's all because of the climate change and the global warming. So all those things are targeted in Sharm el-Sheikh. One important, and this is very important matter, the target in the Glasgow summit was to activate the promises of the budget promised for the countries, where it was promised from the industrial and developed countries to fund project and assist and aid developing countries and least developed countries by providing $1 billion $100 billion every year to be invested in facing those crises and those challenges by trying to utilize them in the adaptation mechanism and strategy and in mitigations. Up till now, those numbers have not been satisfied, and the developed countries are not really committed to those things. So all these are being targeted in Sharm el-Sheikh summit.
I see. In tandem with COP27, the Egyptian government is also hosting the second edition of the Middle East Green Initiative MGI Summit and the Saudi Green Initiative SGI Forum. The Middle East Green Initiative Summit takes place today, while the Saudi Green Initiative Forum will be held from November 11th to 12th.
The second edition of the Middle East Green Initiative Summit and the Saudi Green Initiative Forum take place in Sharm el-Sheikh this year. As the SGI Forum will be held from November 11 to November 12, it's worth noting that Saudi Green Initiative aims to plant 10 billion trees across the kingdom in the coming decades and cut 278 million of carbon emissions by 2023. The MGI Summit is a strategic regional platform that promotes cross-border cooperation, knowledge exchange, and discussion between heads of state, relevant government ministers, and policymakers. The second edition of the SGI Forum, meanwhile, will convene a lineup of climate experts and thought leaders to discuss the progress that has been made toward achieving the climate targets announced by the kingdom last year. The theme of this year's forum, From Ambition to Action, reflects Saudi Arabia's determination to turn these targets into reality by catalyzing collective action to confront climate changes that impact the entire world. Adding that the kingdom focuses on reducing regional carbon emissions by more than 10% of global contributions and planting 50 billion trees across the region as a part of the world's largest afforestation program. The Middle East Green Initiative signifies Saudi Arabia's commitment to international sustainability efforts, as it will enable the region to help protect the planet by clearly defining an ambitious roadmap that contributes to achieving global targets. The first Middle East Green Initiative Summit was hosted by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince in Riyadh on October 25, 2021. It facilitated a first-of-a-kind regional dialogue on climate. The leaders in attendance expressed their appreciation for the Kingdom initiative and effort in the field of environment and climate change. The Middle East Green Initiative Summit aims to create a first-of-a-kind regional alliance and introduce the Middle East First Pact on climate change. It will offer a stage for climate diplomacy and foster the political will need for transformative action. In partnership with the regional countries, the Middle East Green Initiative aims to plant 50 billion trees to reduce carbon emissions and combat pollution. The initiative also aims to enhance the efficiency of oil production and increase the contribution of renewable energy, in addition to multiple efforts to preserve the marine and coastal environment, increase the percentage of natural reserve, and improve the quality of life.
Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, raising awareness and finding solutions, avoiding the worst impact of climate change. Global emissions need to be reduced. It's time for climate action. Pledges and commitments, clean energy and sustainable development to protect the globe.
Welcome again to this Kuwait television live coverage of COP27 hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh with our guest in the studio from the Energy and Building Research Center at Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. Dr. Yehya, can you elaborate on the goal of the Middle East Green Initiative Summit and Saudi Green Initiative Forum and the importance of holding them in tandem with COP27?
Yes, the Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative, it has several important elements. The first important element for the Saudi that announced by His Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, that 10 million trees to be planted in Saudi. And we all know the effect of the greenery on cities and how it helps to reduce the temperatures. So one of the first main target was to plant 10 million trees in Saudi. In addition to that, to increase the natural reserves in Saudi to the extent that occupies 30% of the Saudi lands. So 30% of the Saudi lands will be represented in natural reserves, which will lead to cutting down in the damages and the losses of the climate change. In addition to that, leading to bringing the natural life again. We know because of the challenges of the climate change, many species are disappearing. So when we bring back to life the natural reserve, we are offering the environment and the atmosphere for many species that are under risk of depleted or disappearing to come back and increase in numbers and population. In addition to, we all faced during the COVID-19 crisis, even in Kuwait, when we had the time where we had no cars allowed to be in the street, and people are just using their time to exercise and all the things. This led in protecting the environment, and many species were thought that it has depleted and disappeared. It came back at that time. Many people, auditors for the natural reserves and many places documented the appearing again of those live species that came back to the surface and to life. So having 30% of its lands, the Saudi lands, to be defined as natural reserves will really bring in return very positive effect on the environment in Saudi and the region. In addition to that, the Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative, it was decided to plant 50 billion trees in the region and in other countries. So this is a voluntarily commitment from the Saudi government to help not only mitigate and cut down on the emissions in Saudi, whereas it is a very kind commitment to really help develop the region and the countries of the world by having part of its budget invested in enhancing the environment and mitigating the adverse effect of climate change, also in bringing back the natural reserves in many places. This investment and all those plans, compared to the global promises, the Saudi, with regards to cut down on emissions, overcome by what is promised by the developed countries and the United Nations by about 4%, which is really a big appreciated credit that can be given to the Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative. This is something really for the Saudis and for us really as GCC countries and for the Middle East countries to be proud of.
Exactly, yes. And can you tell us, Dr. Yehya, what are some of the effective measures and steps taken by Kuwait to reduce carbon emissions?
Right. Like I said, the initial effect of climate change and the global warming, but it was because of the Industrial Revolution, and for what the countries which were defined or which are defined as industrial countries, where the industry were developing and still developing in those countries, and where the initial increased emissions were taking place. So for countries like Kuwait, where we were not the main or the major player in adding the adverse effect and the negative harm to the environment, but whereas voluntarily Kuwait started taking positive actions since the recognition of the climate change and the global warming. Actually, if I may go back in history, Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research started its own research on solar energy since the 70s, where those technologies were adopted, hosted in Kuwait, and were tested. During the 70s, we never heard about the climate change and the global warming challenges, and the United Nations did not have any restrictions on countries. So it was a voluntary action taken at that time, but because of the technology was not commercialized at that time, and the cost of investing in renewable energy was very high for a country like Kuwait, where the source of wealth was the oil, it was much smarter really to focus on, let's say, part A of the equation, which is the energy efficiency and energy conservation. So since that time, a team of scientific researchers from Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research collaborated with the Ministry of Electricity and Water and did conduct several studies over a duration of several years, and came up with what is known as the Energy Conservation Code of Practice, where this code restricts some practices in buildings industry where, for example, it forces the individuals or any entity to install, for example, insulation in the walls of the buildings, because we know heat transfer can lead to the the transfer of the heat from outside to inside the buildings. And we know as a hot country in Kuwait, there is a big need to use the air conditioning. So having those buildings without like insulation and any other energy conservation measures will lead to continuous consumption of electricity and having to install big air conditioning systems on buildings. In addition to that, in 2007, with our partners, Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Science, invested a budget of 1 million KD with collaboration with Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research, and we did several studies on the possibility of utilizing renewable energy. So we worked on evaluating the possibility of utilizing the different kind of renewable energy. For example, solar energy, we did what is known as a solar map for Kuwait, where we defined the solar concentrations and the best solar radiations areas in Kuwait. In addition to also, we established what is known as solar map for Kuwait and the best locations where we can utilize the wind for wind energy in Kuwait. In addition to many research areas, the government is funding through Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research and recycling of different materials that can harm the environment, like plastics and other things. Our colleagues also in the buildings industry, they are investing in developing enhanced materials that can really enhance the usage of energy through buildings materials and nanotechnologies. So Kuwait is really way ahead of what is expected from it. The biggest achievement, and we are proud of, is what is known as Shigaya Renewable Energy Power Plant, which is like a renewable energy oasis in Kuwait that already started injecting clean energy to the grid, to the electricity grid, since 2018. So Kuwait really in a position where we can stand up internationally and places like the COP and proudly say that we are in the front of the nations in achieving and protecting the environment and supporting the sustainability and sustainable development.
Well, thank you for your time and valuable insight, Dr. Yehya. We appreciate you, and this is a pleasure having you in the studio with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine. It was an honor being with you and your amazing team over here. Thank you so much.
That was Dr. Yehya Naji Al-Hadban from the Energy and Building Research Center at Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. Climate change is a global emergency that goes beyond national borders, and it is an issue that requires international cooperation and coordinated solutions at all levels. That is why the state of Kuwait, alongside many countries and international organizations, and unions are leading a critical battle in the climate change field.
Kuwait, European Union, the United States and other countries are leading a crucial battle in the climate change field as they are planned a green recovery after the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the climate agreements were announced last year at the virtual climate summit hosted by the United States on the 22nd and 23rd of April, which signaled each country's keen return to the fight for a greener planet, adding that the 27 countries that comprise the EU are making the first steps to achieve this by working to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030. Forward, Kuwait adopted a national plan to enhance climate resilience and to improve community livelihood and achieve sustainability. Kuwait Environment Public Authority, together with the UN Environment and United Nations Development Programme, launched a national initiative in 2017 aimed at designing a national adaptation plan to enhance national adaptive capacity and resilience to reduce vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. In Kuwait, coastal zones and marine life and fisheries are the most sensitive sectors to climate change and its induced disasters. As part of the NAP process, a stock-taking of the past and ongoing climate change adaptation project and initiatives that have been implemented in the state of Kuwait was prepared. Kuwait has implemented several projects to adapt to climate change in the water resources sector. The adaptation to climate change in the public health sector is one of the most critical sectors for Kuwait, and the nation has taken some adaptation projects within this sector. Many projects investing in the agriculture sector are also taking place in Kuwait, in addition to introducing new varieties of crops that can adapt to high temperatures and have high resistance to salinity and drought. Adapting to climate change is becoming an essential component of any planning processes at any time and at all levels. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change acknowledged that national adaptation planning enables affecting countries, mainly developing and least developed countries, to assess their vulnerabilities, to mainstream climate change risks, and to address adaptation. It also acknowledged the need to address adaptation planning in the broader context of sustainable development planning to enable countries to achieve their Millennium Development Goals and, more recently, the Sustainable Development Goals. Hence, the COP established the National Adaptation Plan process to facilitate effective adaptation planning. Despite commitments made at the COP26 last year, this year's UNEP emission gap report shows the international community is falling far short of the Paris goals, with no credible pathway to 1.5 Celsius in place. Policies currently in place point to 2.8 Celsius temperature rise by the end of the century. Implementation of the current pledges will reduce this to a 2.4 minus 2.6 Celsius temperature rise by the end of the century. It is therefore essential to maintain the political pressure and momentum at COP27 and to convince the world's largest emitters to take urgent action to cut greenhouse gas emissions more quickly.
Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, raising awareness and finding solutions, avoiding the worst impact of climate change. Global emissions need to be reduced. It's time for climate action. Pledges and commitments, clean energy and sustainable development to protect the globe.
Welcome again to this Kuwait Television live coverage of the 2022 Climate Summit hosted in Egypt. And now joining us via phone call also is Dr. Sung Jin Baek, Chief Economist at the Office of the UN Resident Coordinator in Kuwait. Good afternoon, Dr. Sung. Good afternoon, Dr. Sun. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me, Dr. Sun?
Yeah, hi. Now I think it's connected.
Okay, can you tell us, Dr. Sung, what is COP27 and what is its importance in Kuwait specifically?
Yeah. First of all, COP27 stands for Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it's 27th conference since 1995. As we all know, this year's conference takes place in Egypt from November 6th, which was yesterday, up until November 18th. So 2 weeks period. During the first week, a World Leaders Summit is organized, followed by discussion about climate finance, decarbonization, climate change adaptation, and agriculture. And the second week will be covering gender, water, and biodiversity, and among others. And why does it matter for Kuwait? As you're aware, the country is known for its hot weather, frequent dust and sandstorms, and air pollution, all of which pose serious health threats to its citizens. And the marine ecosystem in particular at serious risk, while also the country's soil is considered inadequate for farming, thus putting the country's food security at serious risk. Besides, fresh water is a scarce resource in Kuwait, especially over the past few decades. It's been a widely accepted phenomenon that industrialization in Kuwait has been realized largely based on the fossil fuel-driven production method. This growth pattern without a proactive policy for countries' long-term climate resilience raised doubt about the sustainability of the future growth trajectory. In this context, climate change for Kuwait is not only the issue of environment itself, but also socio-economic and broadly our daily life.
What can you tell us about the efforts by UN Office in Kuwait for climate change?
Our office in Kuwait has been working for the past month 3 key milestones. First was we convened an important meeting and event with the theme of climate resilience and sustainable development in collaboration with many partners, especially 3 embassies of UK, Egypt, and UAE. As you know, those are the host country for COP26, 27, and 28. Therefore, our event was to ensure continuity by building on the outcomes of previous COP, to deliver action on the raise of climate change issues. The second milestone was to engage with the Model United Nations, MUN in short. This is an educational simulation in which students can learn and discuss about global development challenges. For this year, American University of Kuwait and Kuwait English School and Kuwait International Law Society were engaged with us and come up with their own resolution about climate action to be presented in the opening ceremony of the UN Day events, which is our 3rd milestone. To be more specific, our UN Day events were held on 26th of October in collaboration with the Kuwait University with the title of Youth Driving Ambition for Climate Action. We opened floors to all relevant stakeholders and government institutions, environmental activists, volunteers, NGOs, and small and medium-sized enterprises to share and showcase their initiatives on environmental sustainability. This was a clear example of multi-stakeholder-led, in other words, community-led climate action that we are really aiming for.
And what can be expected of COP27 for the best interest of the people and the planet?
Well, COP27 will be a crucial opportunity for the world to come together and recommit to keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris Agreement goal alive by defining the 4 collective goals such as mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. Having these 4 goals defined, COP27 has set out an ambitious vision that puts human needs at the heart of our global efforts on the 5 key areas. First is about nature. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. This is not only bad for animals and plants, but also erodes the very foundation of our economies and livelihoods and health. Second is about food. The global food and land and ocean use system represent over 12% of global GDP today and over 40% of all jobs. The food crisis exacerbated by the Russian-Ukraine conflict stretched supply chain and energy prices. And third is about water. Water-related events such as floods and droughts are becoming frequent. In fact, 3 billion people could face physical water scarcity with a 2 degrees Celsius of global temperature rise. Fourth is about industry decarbonization. With our world experiencing radical process of urbanization regardless of global south and north, cement and steel, aluminum, and chemical, as well as ship, planes, and trucks that move them, are currently responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. Last but not least is about climate adaptation. According to our data, almost 3.3 billion people now live in highly vulnerable climate context. So confronting these challenges require an increased public and blended financing and multi-stakeholder partnership, etc., to adapt to climate impact. So all these 5 key areas, of course, but not limited to, will have to be at the center of global talk to achieve its objective as delivering for people and the planet.
What is the impact of climate change on the global economy?
A global economy. Well, in general, global warming would have a negative impact on global economic activity. For instance, it is expected to increase the frequency and severity of extreme weather events, resulting in the loss of infrastructure and property. If the temperature continues to climb, such economic damage will become increasingly permanent, thereby reducing the capital stock and labor productivity and even human health. Well, inflation is also likely to rise over time, potentially driven by rising food prices and increase in the cost of energy, with likely reduction of global crop yields. There was an economic forecasting study done by one Swiss-based institution saying that the global economy could lose 10% of its total economic value by 2015 due to climate change. Of course, such anticipated estimated impacts vary by region and country, depending on their financial resources available to mitigate and adapt, as well as, of course, the geographical condition of being either less or more exposed to diverse weather patterns. Notwithstanding such negative stories, the good news is that according to the Carbon Disclosure Project report, nearly half of the world's 500 biggest companies believe that the climate change could generate over $2.1 trillion in new business prospects. In fact, we are already observing various forms of opportunity in clean energy, green buildings, and energy efficiency related, as well as hybrid and electric vehicle production. There are many more examples, if you will. So in overall, business as usual, yes, climate change has affected and will continue to affect our economy and our life in negative way, but which is why we all gather together to find a solution at COP27.
And lastly, Dr. Seong, how will this year's climate summit contribute to tackling the climate change challenges?
Well, among many, I'd like to share some viewpoints by emphasizing 3 key aspects or players, if you will, that would substantially contribute to our global efforts. Over the past years, the global debate on climate finance has increasingly focused on the potential of private sector. In fact, private sector currently represents close to 75% of global climate finance flows. Also, they do have their own corporate social responsibility initiatives while also promoting environmental, social, and governance reporting, which means that there is a huge room for essential and further collaboration. Second, the Paris Agreement emphasized the bottom-up approach. So COP27 is expected to deliver important message to that community-led climate action is one of the most effective ways of engaging local people and building resilience on the ground as a bottom-up behavior change. It is also crucial to understand that socially vulnerable groups of population are highly sensitive and exposed to climate-related risk. Most importantly, as my final point of consideration, we all must fear that youth are agents of change. We must engage them for innovative ideas by putting them in the driving seat for climate action. We must also provide the best education of green future to our future leaders. I'm really hoping COP27 can pave the way for such ambition to effectively tackle our global challenge altogether.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sung, for your time and valuable insight. That was...
Again, thank you for inviting me for your excellent program.
Heads of states from around the globe are due to convey to the world what the collective plan to tackle climate change is. Their appearances will set the tone for the United Nations-led international climate talks, which officially began yesterday as the accumulating threats of conflict, warming, and economic crisis take a toll on every continent, hitting the world's most vulnerable people the hardest. The COP27 summit presents an opportunity and a space for different participants to engage with each other, exchange knowledge, and strengthen networks. Especially for developing countries, it is also a vital chance to make their voices heard.
COP stands for the Conference of the Parties, which refer to parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, an international environmental treaty that came into being during the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Currently, there are 198 parties, including all United Nations member states, 2 General Assembly observers, 2 non-member states, and the European Union. COP27 is the 27th of these annual meetings, which take place in different regions based on a rational system, with Egypt being the 5th African host country and the first since Morocco in 2016. The need for urgent climate action has been highlighted again and again by an onslaught of climate-related disasters and widespread impacts on global supply chains, national economies, and communities on the ground. Floods, droughts, heat waves, storms, and the creeping changes to rainfall patterns, ocean conditions, soil fertility, animal habitats, and climate zones are already affecting people across the globe. The United Nations in general and the Paris Agreement in specific aim to address this by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, supporting adaptation, and addressing unavoidable losses and damages caused by climate change. Climate change mitigation is perhaps the most highlighted of these 3 aspects in media and public discussion. The Paris Agreement has the goal of holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts and ideally to 1.5 degrees, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risk and impacts of climate change. However, there are other key areas in addition to mitigation, including adaptation. The agreement strives to increase the ability of human communities and systems to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development, as well as channel finance and other means of support from developed to developing countries based on their respective capacities, resources, and responsibilities. COP27 presents an opportunity and space for different stakeholders to engage with each other, exchange knowledge, and strengthen networks, especially for developing countries. It is also a vital chance to make their voices heard, both individually and as part of like-minded negotiation blocs, which will ensure that they can receive the finance and support needed and engage in global climate action according to the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities.
Welcome back, dear viewers, to this live coverage of COP27, hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh. And now we are joined via phone call by Hind Saeed Hani, a foreign affairs editor of Al-Haram newspaper from Egypt. Good evening, Hind. Good evening, Hind. Can you hear me, Hind? Good evening, Hind. We'll seem to be having some technical difficulties. We'll try to get Hind on the line, but until then, we'll take a quick break. Stay tuned.
Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, raising awareness and finding solutions, avoiding the worst impact of climate change. Global emissions need to be reduced. It's time for climate action. Pledges and commitments, clean energy and sustainable development to protect the globe. Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, raising awareness and finding solutions, avoiding the worst impact of climate change. Global emissions need to be reduced. It's time for climate action. Pledges and commitments, clean energy and sustainable development to protect the globe.
Joined via phone call by Hind Said Hani, a foreign affairs editor of Al-Ahram newspaper from Egypt. Good evening, Hind. What steps will be taken by nations to combat global warming and its repercussions?
The main challenge now facing the parties of the conference is to limit the average of temperature rise to 1.5 Celsius degrees, compared to the pre-industrial levels as agreed in Paris Accord. In fact, current pledges, if met, it will only limit the global warming to about 2.4 Celsius, which might pose a climate catastrophe. Countries need, in fact, to agree on further cuts to emissions of carbon dioxide, which causes climate change. Convening countries, should stick to plans to cut the use of coal, which is responsible for 40% of annual carbon dioxide emissions. In COP26, we have seen countries only agreed to a weaker commitment to phase down rather than phase out the coal after late intervention by China and India. Leaders in COP27 should do more to fulfill the pledge to stop deforestation by 2030, and also should work on the scheme to cut 30% of the methane emissions by 2030. As methane is responsible for the third of human-generated warming. The big emitters are China and Russia, and India haven't joined, but it's hoped they will later. The goal is to keep cutting emissions until they reach zero by mid-century.
So the UN is urging the world's industrialized nations to lead by example by taking immediate action. Can you elaborate on that?
Rich countries, including the United States, Canada, Japan, and much of Western Europe, account for just 12% of the global population today, but are responsible for 50% of all of the planet-warming greenhouse gases released from fossil fuels and industry over the past 170 years. Developed countries should do more to move to renewable energy and pay for the damage caused to developing countries by climate change for disasters like drought, floods, and hurricanes. We have seen the world's biggest carbon dioxide emitters, the United States and China, pledged to cooperate more over the next decade in areas including methane emissions and the switch to clean energy. It is important that the tensions between the two countries should not affect this agreement. Ahead of the meeting, countries were asked to submit ambitious national climate plans, but only 25 have done so far.
Thank you, Hind, for your insight and time. That was Hind Said Hania, Foreign Affairs Editor of Al-Ahram newspaper from Egypt. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this live coverage of the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you for joining us.